Hey everybody, Ian from Novel Music here, and in this video we're going to take a look at Staircase. It's our new modulation device. It has 3 sources and 6 targets, allowing you to interact with modulation in new ways. So let's take a look at its features. Each of the 3 sources has 3 different engines, steps, weights, and MIDI. And each of the engines has several input options, including MIDI note input. So you can play your modulation with this device, basically determining the timing on your own of when a signal rises and falls, which is a bit different than most modulators which run at a fixed rate. However, we do also have a internal clock, 3 of them, 1 for each source, that can be used just to run through the steps of a sequence or trigger different weight probabilities, for instance. Let's assign I'm using Drift here. This is a great software synth that comes with Ableton. Let's assign the low pass frequency, which is a dramatic effect that we'll hear very easily. We'll assign that to target 1. And actually, so here's our matrix where you can see you can assign the 3 sources. We have an offset control and we have logarithmic smoothing of rise and fall. But we can actually look at a detail view of just target 1 here, which gives us a scope to see what the modulation signal looks like. So if I just start playing, nothing happens, because when you load this device by default, there isn't any modulation assigned. None of the sources are assigned. So we must go over here. Let's use source A. And now you can see we're generating a very disjunct signal. But we can smooth this out by applying some logarithmic smoothing, which is reflected here on the scope. What makes this special is that we can use not only just source A, but any combination of B and C as well. So to demonstrate that, let's go to B, which is also set to the steps engine with MIDI note input, and we'll create a rising sequence here, and I'll add that in. I'll reduce what I'm using from A, and what we should hear, because look at B, we should hear a modulation that starts low and then rises up, but the shape, overall shape, should still be maintained from source A. So let's see what that looks like. We're going to need to reset the sequence here. Here we go. So it rises over time while still maintaining some of the movement from A. Let's take a deeper dive into the different source engines. So with steps, we have, yes, note input. We also have something called one shot, which goes through the entire sequence with 1 trigger. So instead of it being 1 step at a time, we do all the steps. We also have, again, the free running clock. Going back to MIDI note input, the multi-trig function here determines if every note on message that is received by Staircase creates a trigger, a step in the sequence, or if we switch it off, will it only be the first note on message, and if there are notes held down after that, they are ignored. So that's handy if you don't want every single note you play to trigger a step in the sequence. This is also true with the one-shot mode. I can play multiple notes without re-triggering the entire one-shot. Also, we have control over how many note-on messages we need in order to create a trigger. So the default ratio, of course, is 1:1. For every note-on message, we get a trigger. Well, let's set this to 3. So if I count to 3, 1, 2, 3, we go to the next step. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So this is a way to reduce the speed of the activity happening with the modulation signals. We also can control the probability. when it's all the way at 0, you can see we're stuck here on the 6th step of the sequence. So that's the modulation signal that's going out. So it's just determining the probability that we'll get a trigger. And when we're working in note mode, also in one-shot mode, we have the control over the range, the input range. So you can determine which notes coming in to the device will act as a trigger. So if I set this so that the low note is the low part of the range is higher, then low notes have no effect until I get up here, which is useful if you want to have a moving lower part in this case. When we go into one-shot mode and in clock mode, we have access to the rate control. So rate is controlling, of course, how fast we go through the sequence. We have standard synced tempo relative values. We also have free running time. That doesn't matter what's going on with live transport. It just runs at a set rate that we defined all the way up to 20 seconds. So you can do very slow moving modulation with this device. Let's stick with synced for now. We'll set it to an 8th note, and let's try going through the one shot. And then we can go much faster. So we have all the standard sort of tempo relative values you would expect, and in clock it works the same way. And it stays synced with Ableton's clock. Let's listen to that. And so on. When we're in clock mode, we get access to the deviate parameter, which deviates the rate of the clock itself. So the top here is to control the chance of deviation, and then the value below that determines what will be the deviated value. So right now it's set to 2 times the current value. So if I set this back to 16th note, about 50% of the time we'll have it run at a 32nd note, because that's 2 times faster than the 16th. So it creates interesting kind of stuttery rhythmic variation. We can do this up to 4 times faster than the standard rate, and we can do half the speed or a quarter of the speed. Let's take a look at the weights engine. These other parameters that we've just gone over work similarly in this fashion, but instead of triggering a step in a sequence, we have 5 weights, and the height of the bars here determines how likely one of these weights will be active. And the value that is triggered is what we see above here. So in this case here, let's do a simple one. We can see that this bar on the far right, the 5th weight, is more likely to happen, and that means it's more likely to trigger a value of 1. If I do the other way around, you can see more likely to trigger the value of 0, and you can see all this activity here in the scope. The values up here actually are fully configurable. I just set them to a default that divides the range equally among the 5 weights. Yeah, so it's reactive to whatever it is you have set. I really like using this parameter in context of sort of when you have 2 different values you want to have modulating a signal. This is, let's say you're using an arpeggiator and you have 2 different speeds you want for the arpeggiator. This is a great way to modulate that. Or it's a kind of controlled random, where you know that most likely it'll be one value, but you don't know exactly when it will be the alternate value. Lastly, we have the MIDI engine. This one uses various MIDI data points coming into the device: note, velocity, slide, that's CC74, MPE, pressure, which is aftertouch, MPE. We've got mod wheel expression, CC11. We have the sustain pedal itself, CC64, and something called manual. So for note, for instance, it works as you might expect. We have the higher the note, the higher the modulation signal. But one thing I notice is when you're working with a range of notes, let's say, that's not so wide and maybe is narrow, it would be nice to have more dramatic modulation signals. So that's where the resolution parameter comes into play here. You can control how many possible steps will be triggered. So at full, we get the full 7-bit MIDI range, 0 to 127. But let's say, when we bring it down to 5 steps, we're only going to have 5 different values that are possible. Which gives me more dramatic jumps. And, you can play around with this. It really will behave differently just depending on the kind of MIDI notes that you're sending into it in this case. If I set it to 1 step, then I just have either off or on. So 1 step is possible. And this is true for all the other parameters here is velocity. So I'm getting much more dramatic velocity changes by changing the resolution. When we go to manual, we can just generate our own signal, either by hand, like this. This can be automated, and also you could map this to, well, another instance of Staircase, or using Live's native LFO device. So you can generate your own custom modulation signals with this and use it however you want. Just note that it also is subjected to the resolution in this case, so I can have a really stepped modulation. Let's take off the rise and fall. We can really see this in action. So I can create this stepped modulation while still smoothly moving through the parameter. Yeah, to create different types of effects. And also these parameters some of the settings down here are still available, like the MIDI input range and the chance that we will get a data point to even occur. Something like that. The ratio is active. Just depends. It's contextual. So whatever you have selected, the available options will appear. Now let's take a closer look at the modulation matrix. So over here, as we've seen, you can assign different sources in different amounts. If you go negative, it inverts the signal. So if the original value is 1, it'll be 0, and so on. And we have an offset parameter. So this I'm going to go back to MIDI note input here. We have an offset parameter which will change the center point of modulation. So helpful for dialing in exactly where you'd like the modulation to happen on the parameter. And we've already gone through the rise and fall that we have. If we want to have more control over the parameter that's mapped, we click on this button here, target, and we see that what is revealed is now the settings for the mapped parameter. So those of you who use Live's native modulation devices will be familiar with this view. You can unmap the parameter. I'm going to remap it again. You can control the range in this case, so what the lowest possible note that could be modulated on the parameter and the highest. We also can take advantage of Live 12's new modulation system, where instead of the parameter being completely taken over or remote controlled, so to speak, it is actually still able to be changed manually while modulation is applied to it. My preference actually is the old system. I find that it's easier to get the sounds that I want using that. I've loaded the matrix with some more mappings here. We've got not only the low-pass filter, but the amount of noise on drift, the pitch modulation amount from the LFO, the oscillator 1 waveform. I've got a delay on this track and a chorus, and these are just the amounts of these two. And I've gone ahead and mapped them already and changed some of their ranges. I've done this to demonstrate the global section. So with global, this is where we have control over things that affect the entire device, of course. We can determine whether or not any MIDI will pass through at all. You can see the modulation signals are still generated, but none of the notes pass through, which might be useful in different setups you have. We have this reset feature, which when the live clock is running, you can set this to reset. And these are quarter note values. Let's set it to every 3 because I'm in 3/4 here. So what you can see is the sequencer is jumping back to step 1 every 3 beats, and we have control over that up to 16 beats, I believe. We have a random, and then also you can just set it to the bar of live, whatever the time signature is at that moment. We can scale the time of the clocks in Staircase. So if you have a bunch of clocks going, let's get them all going in clock right now. So here they are moving at the clock rate. We can scale them all together. So that's a handy way to just on the fly change how you'd like to scale things. I'm going to put these back to note for now. And then we have the overall depth of modulation. So you can see that controls the depth of modulation for the entire device, so a handy way to remove all the modulation at once. And that's an overview of Staircase. I really hope you'll enjoy using it. Stay tuned for future videos, and thanks for watching.